All right. So what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you kind of what's going on for the remainder of this week, a little bit of next week, and intro into honestly 3 weeks away. Today, after you finished that paper of the half a page, chapter 22, section 4 quiz that was from yesterday, there is going to be a test review that is posted. You can see it up here on the board. Chapter 22 test review. There's 10 questions. It'll be the same typical test that has 10 multiple choice questions, and then it has 10 maps, graphs, and charts multiple choice question. That will be on Friday. Okay, so you're going to take that chapter 22 test. The review is there. That still gives you today all the way through Friday to make sure that you answer those questions on your own. So that way you're good for a test on Friday. All right, tomorrow and the next day, we're going to hit the base on the French Revolution today and really focus in on how the French Revolution affected the formation of America. All right. As we watch this, be a similar video of what we watched yesterday. As we watch this video, and in the 9 minutes, and like I said, he's blaring and going because there's a ton of stuff that happens, but get a summary about the whole thing. You don't need to know specifics about the exact date, the exact time, the exact name, but you need to have an understanding of kind of how all of this stuff helped, hurt, allowed, similarities of what the American Revolution and the French Revolution was similar to. And that's kind of what we'll discuss at the end of this 9-minute film right there. Next week, again, y'all guys don't have school on Monday. There's staff development. I'll be here. You won't be here. Tuesday, I'll be here. But then Wednesday, Thursday, a bunch of it will be gone for district track. No school on Friday for Good Friday. So next week, we'll start watching the Unbroken Louis Perini movie that'll be there. And then the week after that, we'll get into chapter 25, which will be the Industrial Revolution. We'll play a game on that one for the length of the Industrial Revolution. Tomorrow and the next day will be the introduction to the Industrial Revolution that will help you be able to kind of have an understanding of what went on and why you're doing the game that we'll do at the beginning of April right there. Okay, so today, let me get my screen share on and go to our French Revolution video.
Right, and if you want to see more videos like this, you can donate on Patreon.
And I'll hit the lights for you guys so that way you can see. All right.
The Kingdom of France have been ruled for centuries.
Get full screen. And there you go.
A regime of monarchy, aristocrats, and the church. There was a huge social divide between the wealthy and powerful clergy and nobility and the working people. 18th century Europe was seeing a growth in colonialism, and with many powers trying to come out on top. The French economy had growing pressures and bad harvests and ineffective tax systems which taxed the lower classes heavily, but included many tax exemptions for the nobility and clergy. Sounds familiar. Not to mention the many wars, including aiding the American Revolution against the British. These wars gained little for France itself, but required a lot of money to rebuild their forces. By 1787, King Louis XVI called together the upper-class assembly of notables to address the growing French financial crisis, but it was ineffective. Louis XVI was a pretty ineffective king, quick to back down from the decision, and out of touch with a lot of France in his palace in Versailles. The Age of Enlightenment had seen much forward thinking in science and philosophy, seeking to question tradition and faith using science, with an importance of freedom of thought and freedom of speech. These thoughts spread throughout the people, questioning the king's right to rule, the Catholic Church as well, and its influence within politics and the state of the country. As king, Louis did have supreme power and proposed to tax the nobles, but the Assembly of Notables refused to cooperate. They claimed Louis needed to bring together the Estates General, a general assembly of the three estates of France, the clergy, the notables, and the common people. That next summer in 1789, Louis assembled the Estates General. The clergy and the nobility wanted one vote per estate, giving them a 2-to-1 advantage over the much bigger third estate of the common people. Obviously, the third estate wanted to vote per person, giving them the much bigger number and being much more democratic. But the first two estates couldn't agree to this, so the third estate, which can...
Okay, so instead of just going straight through, kind of break up a couple pieces right here. All right, the first part is we're going to compare this again with the American Revolution. All right. Who is wanting representation in government? in what's going to become the French Revolution the same as American Revolution. Who's wanting representation in government? The upper class, the middle class, or the lower class? The lower class. The common people, which they showed right there, are the majority, want to balance out their voice versus the upper class who has always been in power. Okay. So here's one big thing you need to understand: the difference between a war and a revolution. Okay. A war is a powerful country versus a powerful country, or at least a country versus a country, and they're fighting against each other. A revolution is going to be a country versus an uprising or a militia or a band of other groups of people, mostly poor, mostly lower class, mostly underrepresented. They're going to be in one of those categories, and they're going to fight back against the larger group of organized military. Okay. The same way that the people of the 13 colonies fought back against the power of Britain, the same way that the poor are going to fight back against the power that is France. Okay. So there's going to be some factors that come up, because we talked a little bit about yesterday, and I want you to see how this list goes on and on and on and on and on. How powerful the Constitution, Bill of Rights, everything that was established in the United States in the early late 1700s, and how many changes France has to go to get to what it's going to be. Okay. So right now, taxation is a big deal in France because they're taxing the poor over and over and over. All right. And they're not being represented. The same scenario of the American Revolution of taxation without representation. The American people are being taxed. They're not all poor, but they're in a separate society over here across the way. They're being taxed heavily, but they're not being represented at home in Britain. Okay. And that's kind of a key tie-in together. All right, here we go.
The lawyers and businessmen began meeting independently of the Estates General in what became the National Assembly. The National Assembly was to represent the people, not the estates. Louis didn't like this at all and ordered the Salles des Estates to close, stopping them from meeting. The National Assembly went to a nearby indoor tennis court and swore to not separate until they'd come up with a constitution for France. Members of the First and Second Estates began to join. Louis began to pour the military into Paris and Versailles as support for the National Assembly spread. Louis fired his financial advisor, Jack Necker, as he published dodgy economic figures to the public and manipulated public opinion. All this was seen as a move against what was now the National Constituent Assembly, and the people of Paris began to riot, joined by some sympathetic French guards, leading to the storming of the Bastille, a royal fortress full of weapons and ammunition. The governor of the Bastille ordered a ceasefire, but that didn't stop the mob beating, stabbing, and decapitating them, with a saw no less. The city mayor was butchered and the riots continued. Louis backed down, letting Assemblyman the Marquis de Lafayette command law and order. He proposed to adding national French white to the Paris colours of blue and red to create a new cockade for the National Guard, which would go on to become the French tricolour. Law and order fell apart as word of revolution spread throughout France. Many of the nobility fled to neighbouring countries and looked for help. As panic and rumour spread, the commoners of France formed militias and some stormed chateaux of the nobility. Seeing these rural uprisings, the National Assembly abolished feudalism, ending the flow of taxes from the poor to the clergy and the nobility, bringing more freedom and equality to the people. The people still had to pay or at least to own the land they lived on, but they refused to pay for long enough that they ultimately got the land for free. The old regime of France had been destroyed and a new order was to take its place, eventually. The National Assembly published the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, influenced in part by Thomas Jefferson, who had written the American Declaration of Independence. It was a list of rights and ideals for the Constitution writers to strive for, although it didn't actually apply to women or slaves. By October, crowds of women were gathering in Paris, angered by hard economic conditions and bread shortages. There was growing fear that the aristocrats were hoarding food and starving the poor. They marched on Versailles in protest and on the next day stormed the palace and killed several guards. They demanded that the king move to Paris, which he did, ending his independence. Huge resentment against the Roman Catholic Church led to all its land being confiscated by the government as it took on the church's responsibilities. The clergy in France became controlled by the French, muscling out the influence from Rome. As 1790 came, the government began to organize itself into various opposing parties while they worked on the new constitution. Things seemed to be settling down as the first anniversary.
Okay. So the American ideas and the success that the Americans had with the American Revolution are going to go over to France. Okay. They were going to help essentially form the idea of what's going to be the new constitution, what's going to be the new ideas. All right. So why would France believe that their revolution could be successful? Why would France believe that their revolution could be successful? Yes. Okay. If they look across the sea and they hear the story of America, why would they think that they would have a chance? Okay. And it was what? Was it successful, or did the Americans fail? They succeeded because they formed from the 13 colonies. They started forming what would be the United States. They defeated Britain. Okay. So the powerful empire of Britain, even after all the taxation, even after everything else, was defeated, and the formation of the United States started. So because of that, France was like, have you heard the news? That revolution worked. They got a new government. They formed the exact same thing of like right here, where you're starting to see the differences in, parties coming out. Multiple people, kind of dividing what they are, but having a balance between all. Hang on just a second. Yes, sir. No, sir. Okay. Yeah, no, I'll check it out right there. Not me. See. All right. So you start to see the formation of political parties. You start to see the formation of representation, of equal representation. So with all of that going on, and again, all of this ties back to the idea of the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment was there, because the ideas of the Enlightenment were beginning to spread, that gave people the thought of change, the power of change, to have that added push that they needed to jump out and be able to start these revolutions, to be able to start this going. Okay.
The storming of the Bastille was celebrated in Paris along with King Louis himself. People swearing fidelity to the nation, the law, and the king. Divisions in class saw the military weaken as upper class officers left, unable to control their working class soldiers. Various political clubs began to spring up to debate politics. Most notable was the Jacobin Club. By 1791, the king began to fear for his safety, while his wife urged him to call for foreign reinforcement against the revolution. They decided to flee to the Austrian border, disguised as servants, but were recognized at Varennes and returned to Paris as prisoners. Up until then, people thought the king had supported the revolution. This escape attempt felt like a betrayal, and talks of a republic began to stir. On writing the Constitution, the Assembly were more in favor of a constitutional monarchy, with the king remaining simply as a figurehead rather than a full republic. The people on the streets, however, gathered to sign a petition to depose the king. Lafayette set the National Guards to control the crowd. Stones were thrown and the guards shot dead between 13 and 50 people, depending on who you ask. The Assembly, once the revolutionary body of France, was now clamping down and killing more radical revolutionaries. Louis's brother-in-law, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II, along with the King of Prussia, sought to defend Louis and threatened an invasion if he was threatened further. This really angered the people. The Constitution was completed, the king restored to his place, and the National Assembly was dissolved to allow the new Legislative Assembly to govern as a constitutional monarchy. But it failed miserably and practically fell apart within a year. France had changed so much on the ground amidst the revolution that the government didn't seem to reflect the people. Republican and anti-monarchy ideals threatened to spread throughout Europe, and to strengthen its position, France declared war on Austria weeks after Leopold II died. Prussia came in to help Austria, and France suffered many defeats due to disorganized and deserting armies. In August 1792, veterinary soldiers of the Paris government attacked the king's palace, massacred the king's guards, and captured the king. A rump session of the Legislative Assembly was held, consisting mainly of revolutionary Jacobins, to suspend the monarchy. The Paris government was essentially in control now, but Austrian forces were advancing on Paris. Fearing traitors within the prisons, they had many prisoners killed and urged other French cities to follow suit. And they did. But then, of course, these acts were seen as too harsh, and politics rolled up into another mess. It was then voted upon, and the Convention Assembly became the new government, which would write another new constitution. It immediately abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic, a system of government where the leaders are representing the people, usually elected by the people, and thus should reflect the needs and opinions of the people. At least that's how it should work. The 22nd of September 1792 became the dawn of the French Republic, coinciding with a decisive victory at the Battle of Valmy against the Prussian invasion 2 days before. France had proof it could be strong. France continued to win victories in the Rhinelands and Austrian Netherlands, grabbing the attention of Britain and the Dutch Republic. Because he tried to flee the country, Louis XVI was tried by the Convention Assembly and found guilty of high treason by conspiring with the enemies of France. So they executed him in January 1793. This really woke up the rest of the monarchs of Europe, who went to war with France, initially taking back much of what was gained. The war continued to put a strain on food supplies in France, allowing the radical Jacobins to seize power. Led by Maximilien de Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, they sought to stamp out anti-revolutionaries in France. So they executed thousands of people in what became known as the Reign of Terror. They confiscated grain and food from the countryside to feed cities and control food prices, but this didn't go down too well either. At this time, even suspicion of being against the revolution could have you sent to the guillotine. The government began conscripting people to strengthen the weakened army. During the Reign of Terror, the government became extremely anti-Christian, closing and destroying churches, designing new 10-day calendars to forget when Sunday was, and establishing alternative churches like the Cult of Reason, but was ultimately a step too far as it led to counter-revolutionary movements, including Vendée in West France, which would fight against the revolutionaries until 1796, suffering massive massacres on both sides, again depending on who you ask. People ultimately got sick of the terror, and it was voted to have the Jacobin Club banned and Robespierre himself executed, along with many others, because why not at this stage? The coalition of countries against France were unwise to not take advantage of these internal fights, and by summer 1794, France pushed right back through Austria and Netherlands and even into the Dutch Republic itself, forming a puppet state. Prussia and Spain ultimately made peace with France in 1795, while Austria and Britain and others remained at war with them. The French government had settled on the constitution of the year 3, establishing yet another new regime called the Directory, run by 5 directors, and it wasn't too successful either. France tried to aid Irishmen Theobald Wolfstone in a Republican invasion of Ireland against British rule in 1796, but failed to land due to bad weather. France's army continued to win victories in Switzerland and Italy, led by a very successful tactician named Napoleon Bonaparte. Austria sued for peace as he marched on Vienna, ending the war of the First Coalition. A second coalition of monarchies, including Britain, Austria, Russia, and others, joined against Republican France in 1798. Napoleon knew France's navy wasn't yet ready to take on the might of the British navy, so he decided to invade Egypt and disrupt the British trade route to India. British naval commander Lord Nelson came down and destroyed Napoleon's ships, keeping Napoleon's forces stuck in Egypt. In 1799, hearing of defeats in France, Napoleon made his way back to Paris and overthrew the Directory, ultimately with yet another constitution declaring himself the first consul. Though it was still a republic by name, it was very much a military dictatorship with Napoleon at the head. The revolution had set out to stop one guy controlling everything, and by the end of it, they again had one guy controlling everything. Napoleon pushed against the coalition, leading to victory against the Holy Roman Empire in 1801 and Britain in 1802. They would remain at peace for another 14 months, and then would follow what would become the Napoleonic Wars. But sure, I can tell you about that some other time. Right.
All right. Let me turn on the lights. Okay, so let's start with the easy one. If we're comparing the idea of leadership, in the end, how was the US Revolution, American Revolution, end all be all, person that is picked to be the representative for us? And how is the French Revolution, end all be all, person to pick as their representative? How are they the same? What is similar to the first president of the United States and the last ruler of the French Revolution? What's the similarity to it? Who's the first president of the United States? George Washington. Who was the last ruler in this film that had to do with the French Revolution? It's a little guy. Napoleon Bonaparte. All right, so both of those guys are military leaders. All right, they are successful military leaders. Does the world want to follow someone who loses or follow someone who wins? Wins. Okay, so the United States chose the backing of General George Washington. Okay. And because of that, that's their first president. That's the face of a country. All right. That is the backing of the country. The same way that it shows through the whole system that they were trying to get away from one king ruling over them and leading them as the French. However, they ended up with the exact same situation, just without the name king, but it was the leader slash consul slash dictator of France in Napoleon. Okay. Military leaders who have success have a great following, and that's what both of these revolutions come out of. So, how did the formation and the finalization of the French Revolution lead to America being successful? How did the French Revolution aid America in becoming America? There's a couple different ways, but what were some of the big key points? Why, if they hadn't had the French Revolution, I don't know if America would have been formed. I don't know if America would have been formed remotely of what it is today, or if it would have been formed as fast as it would have been. So what are some of the reasons why the French Revolution aided in America becoming America? What can you think of? How did the French Revolution help America become America? What's one of the biggest things they had a problem with in France because of all the wars, because of everything else? Money. They lost money on all of these wars and having to stay with these wars. So then America, United States, lost its level of concern because it cost so much money to get to the Americas, to keep that land, to fight for those people. The same way that the Haitian Revolution happens. I mean, France could have dominated the Caribbean. That's going to be a big trade route as far as that goes. However, it cost too much money to maintain the Caribbean that was there. All right. So therefore, they had to lose the Haitian Revolution and go back to France. It was money they could not waste. It wasn't worth the effort in the battle. Because France was having to take care of so many other things around them here, they lost money. Therefore, they sell land that they own in the Americas, which doubles the size of the America and allows them to continue to start growing further and further and further. All right. So if we hadn't, have you ever like tried to read a book and like a fly just keeps coming by you?
No.
And then like you got to hit the fly, you're watching TV and you got to hit the fly and keep going. Okay. You can't focus in on what you're doing because you're being distracted over and over and over and over and over. All right. France couldn't take care of the Americas because they kept getting distracted by all of those neighboring countries that were trying to go to war, that were trying to expand themselves over the top of France. So that really helped out that was there. Okay. Again, the lessons learned about the United States and the idea of how long the Constitution, the Declaration, all of that withstood versus the changes that France had. All right. Why were the common folk in France wanting to revolt? Why were they always revolting? There's about 3 or 4 different scenarios that they presented within there. But what are some of the reasons why they revolted? Why did they want change? What was the difference? Remember, you got to have essentials in life: food, water, shelter. They were missing one out of those. Remember the story about the women that were in there? They're going to go to the king's castle, palace, where he lives at, and they're demanding something. What were they talking about in there? Bread. The women revolted over bread because they didn't have food to feed their own families. And at the same time, they felt that the king and the queen and the people that were living within the king and queen's dwelling there, they were living a high life. All right. They were eating a plentiful amount. They were feeding the people that were with them a plentiful amount. They were withholding grain, bread, storage of the food to distribute it out how they felt needed. And instead, the women revolted against this and wanted that food back. Okay, because they thought they were holding out on them. Then it goes into the idea of how it ends feudalism. It ends the pyramid of uppers to middles to lower. The lower class actually gets to own the land. The common folk have a chance to go back and kind of own land, have ownership. But when you gain more, then you have to pay more. So therefore your taxes get increased. But what you're at least working for is yours rather than somebody else's that's there. Okay. So the reason why America ties into the French Revolution, the idea of they were distracted, so therefore we could expand. All right. The overall part of, again, the success of the Americans led to the French Revolution because they were able to get away from Britain. All right. They had to give up on the Americas pretty much at some point because there was so many other things going on around them that it was better to take care of themselves than it was to take care of something else that they couldn't maintain. And then all of the trouble and all of the revolutions, honestly, they kept going back and forth and back and forth, made them weakened to the point of where they couldn't expand as much as they want to. They had to be distracted by what was going on at home. Okay. So the French Revolution itself, in the end, is successful because it leads for them to what is a more open government. It gets away from the king and queen. There's representation that's established there, even though in the end Napoleon becomes in charge. But it leads to the fact of more similar to the American idea of democracy. Did the Americans aid the French in forming some of their revolutions? Talked a little bit about around the late 1700s era that they actually took ideas from the American Declaration, the Bill of Rights, to form their own ideas, to be able to say, hey, that's working for y'all. I like what's going on. Let's write the same thing, all right, but about France. So then that way we can gain that independence. The world still strives to gain democracy, to gain independence for the common person. And that's the reason why a ton of people really like the idea of representative democracy. Whenever new countries break apart, whenever new countries overthrow governments, they want a democracy. Okay, so that's the introduction for you for the French Revolution. If you got a little bit of time in class, again, I urge you to go back there to chapter 22, test, review, go and start on those 10 questions, and you're good to go. And that's your assignment for today.